It appears even at that time the intended focus of the central bank was hotly contested. It seems that Coombs and his colleagues in the then Ministry of Post-War Construction were keen that a commitment to full employment be reflected in the legislation establishing the bank, but the Treasury and the bank itself argued that price stability should be the primary focus. In the end, it was agreed to include both and to add the third of, in effect, economic growth and prosperity. I've always been a supporter of the Reserve Bank's multiple goal charter. Trade-offs between price stability and employment are inherent in most monetary policy decisions, and I think the explicit reference to employment among the legislated goals of the bank is a plus. I know how this reference, this inclusion, can help in ensuring that employment considerations are given proper weight in those trade-off deliberations, more weight, in fact, than might otherwise be the outcome if that commitment wasn't explicitly recorded. Another possible macro-distributional issue regarding monetary policy is worth mentioning. The Australian government stimulus package has been criticised by some people on the grounds that it will lead to burdensome budget deficits and debt levels. It's also been argued by the same critics that those kinds of measures will result in interest rates being higher than they would otherwise be. In terms of their broad effects on aggregate spending, though, there might not be a lot of difference between cutbacks in government spending and an increase in interest rates. But you don't really hear those who are advocating cutbacks in government spending canvassing the alternative of an increase in interest rates. But even if the choice were to be between expenditure cutbacks and reductions in interest rates, as is implied in the arguments that the critics make, there could be distributional consequences to be considered, depending on, for example, the nature of the cutbacks involved. Effecting cutbacks in programs, spending programs of particular benefit to needy groups with a view to holding down interest rates might not be a good deal on distributional grounds. In short, monetary policy actions can have significant distributional consequences. They are mainly macro and untargeted in their impacts, but they shouldn't be ignored for those reasons. And perhaps I should end there. Thank you.
I thought I heard Bernie get very close to sponsoring a new Glass-Steagall Act in Australia. Was that where you were heading then?
I think the Americans should be thinking very seriously about it. This was the act that was put in place some decades ago that prevented the commercial banks from engaging in certain kinds of activity, separated commercial banks from the risk-taking investment banks, but that act was closed down, removed, 10 years ago, John? Something of that, in fairly recent times.
It's more than that, it's about 25 years ago, I think now. But it was put in at the time of the Great Depression, as I understand it.
That's right.
To separate investment banks from commercial banks.
Right. But the Wall Street lobbyists were effective in having that abolished, and so that commercial banks could get into the act of making risky investments, sponsoring speculative activities and so on, and that it has been alleged has contributed to the growth and extension of the subprime problem, and it's against that background that some people in America anyhow are raising the possibility of reintroducing something like that act in the US. I wasn't really going down quite that road, John, but it seems to me that with government guarantees for deposit taking and fundraising and so on, that we need to have a clear idea as to which are the banks that are deserving of this kind of government backing and who the ultimate recipients should be. And I think it's fine for governments to wish to provide guarantees to banks and institutions that provide ordinary products and accept the deposits, maybe even make housing loans and so on. But it would be unfortunate if banks that were engaged or prone to engage in investment, speculative investment type activities, also somehow managed to have access to deposits that were boosted by the existence of government guarantees. So I think there is an issue there that is worth clarifying.
I suppose, Peter Martin, the agent, Sydney Morning Herald, I suppose the problem is how do you unscramble the egg? We've got the situation where our existing banks have that guarantee, and in fact all sorts of foreign banks in Australia have that guarantee, and how do you take it away from them, or do you say you can only continue with this guarantee if you then henceforth abandon speculative ventures? How do you actually? How would you manoeuvre that transition? And the second question is, do you support for this reason? You seem to be heading in that direction. A new Wallace inquiry to look at these sort of things.
On the second question, I wasn't in favour of the first Wallace inquiry. So,
that doesn't mean you don't support it.
I'm not going to advocate a second Wallace inquiry, but on the first question, what governments provide, governments can take away, and that's not a rare occurrence. But if the government were to, or if there were to be some kind of examination of the worthy recipients of the guarantee and unworthy aspirants for that sort of protection, I think it would be a fairly easy matter for the government to sell a separation of that kind. It's not hard to sell things that are soundly based and well thought out and carefully presented.
Well, Bernie, Phil Lasker from ABC TV. The United States doesn't have a formal inflation target. We do. Is it possible that that could be inconsistent with, sometimes inflation targeting could be inconsistent with trying to maintain maximum employment?
It could be if you had a rigid, narrow target, a target that, as many of the early legislated inflation targets were, very narrow, 0 to 2%, to be achieved not over the period of the cycle, but to be achieved year in, year out, then you are inviting conflicts with employment and growth, and I think some of the countries that started off this way have realised the folly of that and have backed off in fact towards a more flexible arrangement of the kind that we had from the early 1990s, a flexible inflation target, one that talks of keeping inflation around 2 to 3%, but doing so not year in, year out, but over the course of the cycle. And that is what is a good illustration of what I mean by being pragmatic and sensible about these things. And I think the fact that we had such a target rather than one of those more narrow, restricted things has helped us to do rather better than the New Zealanders or some of the Scandinavian countries that jumped in with these very narrow, precise targets. The other interesting thing about the inflation target that we have, and which we've had now for 15 years or more, is that it's not a legislative target, as most of the targets are that central banks have. The Americans are different, as you noted, but in most cases these targets were legislated in relation to the central bank's functions in the countries concerned. Our target evolved. It came to be accepted by governments and trade unions, financial markets, public generally, but it's never been legislated, but that hasn't in any way reduced its effectiveness. In fact, again, it's part of this general pragmatic approach, which I'm a great fan of, have always been so, but have become more so following some time in the bank, and subsequently when one wakes up every morning and sees some new challenges looming that have to be dealt with, and they're best dealt with pragmatically, I think, rather than having a view that that's something for the market or that's something for government to deal with.
Bernie, John Sutton, trade unionist. You got through that whole talk about the Australian economy without using the S word, the long S word, that is, superannuation. Now, being the face, I think, of certainly industry super, and knowing you well, I think you do see superannuation as I don't know whether we call it a new tool in the kit bag or an important asset that we have at our disposal, I'll use that expression, here in Australia, something that wasn't around 25 years ago, the accumulation of capital we now have in our domestic economy. So can you reflect a bit on where, that tool, if I call it that, in the kit bag, how important that is in terms of managing our economy going forward?
Yes, John, I think there should be a spot for it in the toolkit, and when Warwick was talking about the possibility of sustained terms of trade gains over into the future and what might be done with the proceeds, I was thinking that I hope we don't make the same mistake or fail to pick up the opportunities that we failed to pick up over the last few years when those enormous terms of trade gains flowed into the economy and in large part were dissipated by tax cuts, which boosted consumption, which in part required the Reserve Bank to run around and pick up behind the government. This was a period when monetary and fiscal policies weren't working as well as, or weren't as well coordinated as they might be and as they need to be as more and more challenges loom. But there would have been an opportunity, there was an opportunity then to channel part of this largesse from the terms of trade gains, not into tax cuts as such, but into superannuation, to do something about boosting that 9% to 12%. 9% is adequate for some people to provide a decent retirement income, but it's not nearly enough for very large numbers of people, and large numbers of people on lower incomes, lower account balances that haven't had a long exposure to the 9%, who are women who have been in and out of the workforce and don't have a good deal of exposure. And for lots of people who, because they're going to, many young people now coming into the workforce are going to spend almost as much of their life in retirement as they are in the workforce, they're going to run out of retirement income unless there's some adequate provision, self-provision for this. And moving on from the 9% to a higher figure, 12% or whatever, is good policy, should be an important policy objective, is in the kind of framework that I have. And if those terms of trade gains continue, as I think Warwick was suggesting they might, that would provide an opportunity to make some real progress. in that area. At the same time, I would have to say that the sequencing of changes here is important. The present system is very costly to tax revenue. Treasury estimates of the tax expenditures involved in superannuation come to about $25 billion a year, and that's down from about $30 billion in the last couple of years. But some of those tax expenditures, some of those tax concessions aren't well directed, and the former Treasurer Costello, in one of his parting gestures, was to make that direction even less attractive by providing that opportunity to stack away $1 million in super and take it out tax-free later on. And it might have simplified the taxation arrangements, but it did nothing for equity. So I think in terms of sequencing some changes, it's important to try to get a better tax arrangement within the 9% so that more of the tax preferment there goes to people on lower income groups, more needy people. And once that's sorted out, to press hard for some movement on the adequacy side, the 9% to the 12%, to go to 12% or to start going to 12% now with all these inefficiencies and inequities in the current tax arrangements wouldn't make a lot of sense. But when they're sorted out, I think there are lots of reasons for contemplating some further progress, and lots of issues in all that, but there are lots of challenges too, and moving from 9 to 12%, even if part of that increase was to be dedicated towards providing for health expenditures in retirement, would be progress, because the way health costs are skyrocketing and contributing to that longevity that everyone is talking about, there's no way the public purse is going to be able to provide adequate health cover for the ageing population over the decades ahead. But some self-provision would be a way, through a related superannuation arrangement, would be a way of providing an opportunity for ordinary people to have access to that kind of assistance in their retirement. So it's important, and I hope it's not lost. I think the government has said at the outset that changing the 9% wasn't part of the Henry tax review, but there have been a few encouraging noises from Chris Bowen and a couple of others from the sideline that this is an option that shouldn't be brushed aside and should still be considered.
Rory Robertson, Macquarie Bank. Mr Fraser, a bit over 2 decades ago, before you were Reserve Bank Governor, you were Treasury Secretary. Today's Treasury Secretary, Dr Henry, is looking at the Australian tax system with a view how it could be improved. Do you have any thoughts on how Australia's income and capital gains tax systems might be improved for the general benefit of the Australian economy and Australian people in general?
Thanks, Rory. I do have some views, but they don't count for anything these days, I'm afraid. But Ken's got enough wood on him without putting more wood on him. But I would hope that various things will come out of the review, and one of those things I'm hoping will relate to the coordination of policies generally. That is to turn to fiscal policy to supplement monetary policy as appropriate, rather than leave monetary policy to bear the burden of dealing with asset price booms, for example, when if one was able to drum up the political courage, some changes to tax measures would be a more effective way of heading off some of those booms. That involves, for example, changing things like the rates of capital gains tax, and dare I mention it again, negative gearing. I helped persuade Paul Keating to move in that direction once, and the measure was in place for a short term before it was rescinded, and Paul Keating hasn't forgiven me ever since. But more basically, Rory, I'm hoping that the tax review will start by being producing a fairer tax system. Fairness seems to me something that everyone pays lip service to but then forgets to do much about. And I'm old enough to have old-fashioned views about fairness and tax systems. And I think two basic principles, and I don't know whether Ken's here, but he can switch off while I mention these old-fashioned views. But one element of fairness to me is that a dollar is a dollar of income, whether it's a dollar earned through wages or through capital gains, and to have the kind of the differential and the preference for capital gains tax that we've got now is unfair and just encourages people to channel, those who can, to channel more of their income through capital gains than the income tax structures generally. And secondly, that I think an element of progressivity in the tax system is essential for fairness, and the only real element of progressivity that we have in the income tax in the whole tax system is income tax. And over the years, this has been diminished. I think it's fair to say it's been diminished. Marginal rates have been coming down. GSTs have been put in place, which, if anything, regressive, certainly not progressive, so that there's been some diminution of that progressive element in the tax system, and I think that distracts from a fair system of tax. But thanks for the question, Rory.
Nicholas. Nick Whitlam, inter alia former banker. Picking up the points about the broad spectrum of risks that banks, authorised banks, that are now undertaking, all with government guarantees on their deposits on the one hand, and on the other hand the concentration of savings that we now see in the big four private banks. And I'm conscious that you have a potential conflict with Members Equity Bank, modest one perhaps. Have you set your mind, have you thought about that proposal which came from a number of commentators with different political perspectives, individual political perspectives, of a new post office bank or a Giro bank?
Yeah, it has been something that comes up in the context of setting business plans and aspirations for, as you say, this modest members' equity bank, and that's all in a context where the four major banks are now writing 90% of housing loans, for example, and that proportion's been going up, and they match that by the proportion of deposits, so almost match that. But the major banks have some obvious advantage by virtue of their size and reputations and so on in raising deposits and so on. But one wonders about the degree of concentration and whether 90% of a particular market is enough. And I think there have been enough murmurings that it is enough, and that ideally might be unwound, but more desirably that there could be effective competition that would over time acquire a larger share. There are no obvious contenders there unless some of the few smaller remaining players were to somehow get together or and combine and be more aggressive in competing against the majors. And I think they could make quite a fist of that, because the majors are not the sort of most favoured banks among banking customers, but there's a lot of inertia there, so it'll be a very difficult task. And sort of part of that strand of thinking is the idea of having a post office type bank that would come up, that would have its branch structure in place, that would be favourably supported by the government in some way or another, and would be able to make real impact into the ordinary banking system. But I think these are things that will become a bit clearer, will unravel. There will be some moves in those directions, I think, in time, partly because the public doesn't want to see the majors further increase their share of the banking market, and I don't believe this government does either.